Hello, everyone. Today we have with us Dr. Ayoush Lazikani. She's a departmental lecturer in the Faculty of English at the University of Oxford. She teaches at Jesus and Oriel Colleges, and her research focuses largely on the history of emotions, specializing in devotional writing of the 11th to 13th centuries. So, from what I can tell from your research, you're very interested in the roles of feeling and emotion in medieval and religious texts. And I know a lot of graduate students find it difficult to pinpoint their research on something or someone. And I was wondering what you think of that process of choosing who or what to study. How do you approach that process of pinning down what resonates with you and what led you to your own research?
Thank you, Daphne. Thank you very much for having me. It's lovely to be here.
Thank you.
Um, and that's a great question to start off with. It's interesting that we're talking about emotion and given your question, because I think pinpointing what you want to study is in itself a very emotional process. At least it was for me. For me, a lot of it was about listening to lectures, listening to podcasts, listening to other people talk about their interests. And it was really quite an emotional, visceral reaction to the subjects that I was particularly drawn to. So I remember, for example, going to lectures as an undergraduate student. Um, lectures on medieval anchorites, and I just remember this really deeply emotional, visceral reaction, thinking, I really love this subject. This really resonates with me, and it's difficult to pinpoint exactly what that is, what it was about medieval anchorites that particularly spoke to me. I think perhaps that emphasis on an interior world, a rich interior world, a rich imaginative landscape. I think that really spoke to me, that this idea that you could withdraw from the world and just focus entirely on an inner world. I think that really spoke to me. And as I went through my career, I realized that I noticed a lot of connections with medieval Islamic literature. Um, so the solitaries in the Christian religion, I could see a lot of connections with Islamic solitaries as well, Sufis. And I'd read a bit of Sufi poetry growing up. My family is originally from Syria, so I grew up speaking Arabic, and my parents exposed me to Sufi literature, and so I started to make connections. And again, it was a very emotional process, that those sort of connections that I was making, not in even in entirely a cognitive one, but more an emotional reaction to themes, subjects, ways of life that I found just very inspiring.
That's amazing. Yeah, kind of like connecting the subject matter of emotion to the process also being linked to emotion. It being an emotional process is super interesting because I guess it's kind of almost magical that you can't really pinpoint what exactly draws you to something, a certain topic, which is really amazing.
Exactly. And I think it's very easy to imagine academic research as being purely intellectual, but I think a lot of people who work in academia will say that there's a really strong emotional component to what they do as well, and the intellect and the emotion are always working together.
Definitely, definitely. Yeah. And I was wondering if you could give us a bit of background on the kinds of text that you study. So, what are some of the characteristics that mark a devotional or a contemplative or a spiritual medieval text?
Yeah, again, great question. So, in the Christian traditions, the kind of texts I study are for religious recluses or anchorites. Um, these were people who would withdraw from the world and live attached to a church in a cell. And they would spend their whole lives in that existence, just devoting themselves to the God they believed in. with the Islamic tradition, the Sufis didn't necessarily live an enclosed life in that way, but they did follow a deeply spiritual path, again, entirely committing themselves to the God they believed in. So, devotional, contemplative, spiritual, they're all terms that I use to try to qualify religious, because religious is such a big nebulous term. So devotional, any text that encourages a complete devotion, complete focus, attentive focus and devotion on the God believed in, devoting your entire life to the God you believe in. Contemplative, that's a slightly trickier term, but it's the way I understand it, it's to do with trying to reach God. So engaging in practices, engaging in thought processes, emotional processes that bring you closer to God. That's how I understand contemplative. It involves a lot of different kind of activities. It could involve reading, prayer, even manual labor, but all different kinds of activities that bring you closer to God, I see as contemplative. And spiritual is more just a general term in my mind for understanding different religious traditions that are focused on the inner workings of the self, thinking about what the human soul is and how it can draw closer to God.
Definitely. That makes a lot of sense. Are these writers often women or are they both sexes?
That's thank you for pointing that out. Mostly they're men.
Mostly men.
Mostly
Interesting.
men. Yeah, sometimes the audiences are definitely for women. So, for
Yeah.
example, a lot of the Christian texts I look at were written specifically for women who became anchorites, who became
Mm,
religious recluses. But although in both the Christian and Islamic traditions, mostly they're men who are writing. It doesn't at all discount the possibility of women's involvement in the creative process. So the women for whom the Christian texts I look at were written for, they likely had quite a lot of input in the texts and how they were written, and a lot of men who were Sufis had women teachers, women guide mentors, or women's guides, and were really taught by women. And Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, who's one of the Sufi poets I look at, his famous collection of poems, Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, the interpreter of desires, was inspired by an encounter with a woman. So even though they're mainly written by men, either definitely written by men or it's assumed written by men, women have a really important role in the creative process.
definitely. They kind of inspire some of the text, if you will.
Inspire, have input in, um, kind of guide the texts. Yeah, definitely.
Definitely. And I'm wondering, are these writers like similar to monks in monasteries? Because that's often where my mind goes, or like Buddhist ascetics, like where my mind goes when I think of someone who devotes their life to religion, someone who writes solitarily every day and focuses on their religion, their beliefs, their God. I think of these kinds of keywords that we often speak about in the modern day. So do they have links to monks and ascetics, or is this kind of another group?
I think they absolutely have links to monks and ascetics. If we think about the Christian tradition that I look at, um, anchorites kind of went one step further than monks or nuns. They kind of took their ascetic lives to a greater extreme. But some of the anchorites may well have been monks or nuns before becoming anchorites, and becoming an anchorite was a kind of a step further. It was seen as a kind of higher form of life, a more intense form of devotional life, but absolutely had very many ascetic elements. Sufism had has or had ascetic elements as well. Sometimes not as starkly as in the Christian tradition, I found, but it definitely has elements of asceticism, that kind of punishment of the self, to bring yourself closer to God. I think both the Christian and Islamic contemplative traditions show elements of that, but perhaps it's more pronounced in the medieval Christian, than the medieval Islamic.
Definitely. And I was wondering, how do these characteristics of these texts that you kind of drawn out, how do they differ across 12th and 13th century texts? For example, written in English, Arabic, Anglo-Norman texts, Persian texts, and Latin cultures, how do they remain similar amongst these cultures? What differences and similarities can we find across different languages, different groups of people writing, across the Islamic and Christian traditions? And also, how are they similar?
Love, Lovely question. So, one of the key differences when we're thinking of Christian texts written in, say, English, Anglo-Norman, or Latin versus Islamic texts written in, for example, Arabic or Persian, is a theological difference with Jesus Christ, the figure of Jesus. Because whereas in the Christian tradition, Jesus Christ is the Son of God, of course, he's the divine incarnate, he's divine in human form, the divine taking on human flesh. In the Islamic tradition, Jesus is a very revered prophet, but he's not God. He's not identifiable with Allah. He is just a prophet. And so that's quite a major theological difference between the texts, between the Christian and Islamic texts. Um, yeah, but in terms of similarities, I found um, in my book Cry of the Turtle Dove, some of the similarities I found have been really centered on how they navigate emotion, spiritual emotion, and this drawing closer towards God. And actually, I took my starting point as Jesus, because although Jesus is understood so differently in the religious traditions, he has a he has this role of being the model lover in both the Christian and Islamic traditions, this idea of him being the perfect lover of God, that we see in both traditions. But in the Christian one, he's also the beloved of, he is the beloved himself. He is the beloved that the loving soul yearns for and reaches for. So it's interesting how Jesus works differently in those traditions, but also similarly. I also found a lot of emphasis on the human body in the text. So a lot of emphasis on flesh and blood, and how flesh and blood can be used to understand both closeness to and distance from God. And I also found a lot of emphasis in both traditions on secrecy and absence. This idea that God is both present and absent, that he is a secret that needs to be uncovered, that he's a kind of code that needs to be decoded. We find these themes in both the Christian and Islamic traditions.
That's amazing. Seeing so many similarities across such different cultures, so many miles apart. That's really incredible, actually. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
I think it's such a worthwhile goal to search for those similarities, while being sensitive to contextual difference. I think searching for those similarities is such a worthwhile goal. I mean, recently in the world of medieval studies, there's been a move towards something called the global Middle Ages, which I believe is a term coined by Geraldine Heng. And it's really this emphasis on expanding our perspective of what the medieval world was, not focusing solely on the West and Europe, but thinking about many different regions, cultures, languages. And I think searching for bonds and connections across those traditions, those cultures can be really worthwhile.
Definitely, definitely. I want to turn to the book Cry of the Turtle Dove, and I'm going to turn to your Oxford profile, which uh, in your Oxford profile, you define an approach of what you call avian emotion that you use in this book, Cry of the Turtle Dove, emotion in Christian and Islamic contemplative texts, circa 1100 to 1250, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2021. And so in your Oxford profile, you write regarding this book, quote, an approach of avian emotion invites us to gaze across cultures as well as within them, migrating from one to the other with sensitivity. Just as a bird flies across continents and nations, a comparative study seeks to become a kind of flight, moving across regions while remaining sensitive to the specific rhythms of the surrounding environment. This is a brilliant quote and a brilliant approach, and I would love to hear a little bit more about it. So, can you tell us why it is so important to approach comparative studies as a kind of flight or migration, and how you do ensure that you move across different cultures with this sensitivity?
Thank you very much for your kind words. This idea of avian emotion, it was really inspired by the texts I study themselves, because across both the Christian and Islamic works, they see they see the human soul as a bird. So in both the Christian and Islamic texts, they see the soul as a bird. In one of the English texts I study, the Christian English texts called Guide for Anchoresses. So anchoresses is means a female anchorite. In that text, it imagines the anchorite soul as being different birds in flight. We find this also in John of Howden, talking about the soul as a nightingale. Another author, this time writing in Anglo-Norman, the French of England. When we look at the Islamic texts, in the collection of poems I mentioned by Ibn Arabi, Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, the soul is often imagined as a dove or different kinds of doves. And there's also a text that you and your listeners may well have heard of, called The Conference of the Birds, by a Persian poet, Attar of Nishapur, who in which the human soul is understood as a bird. And the story of that poem is the birds of the world unite to seek their king. Their king is the mythical bird called the Simor. They go and seek him, but when they do, they realize that he is a reflection of themselves. So it's this idea of the human soul seeking God and seeing in God a reflection of the human soul. So basically, the avian emotion really stemmed from this rich tradition of understanding the soul as a bird. And I was inspired to think of not just the soul as a bird, but the comparative approach itself as being like a bird in flight. Because a bird I thought it has a kind of non-hierarchical way of movement. It flies across different regions. I'm not a scientist. I don't understand the technicalities of how birds fly, but a bird moves across regions, but there's a kind of equality to its movement. It doesn't, you know, there's not one region is not exalted above another in a bird's flight. And I thought that that's quite a useful way for understanding the comparative approach, that when we're studying studying comparatively, it's important not to have one tradition dominate the other. When I was working on the book, I was particularly worried about, but because my background is in medieval English studies, in my academic background, I was really worried about the medieval English texts dominating all the other texts, and then it doesn't become an equal dialogue. So, an Avian approach to emotion is about giving different traditions a kind of equal footing, um, giving the giving the traditions an equal say, an equal voice, allowing them to be in a kind of dialogue rather than one overwhelming the other. So it's that kind of equality and non-hierarchical thinking across regions, across cultures.
That is such a beautiful description of avian emotion, and that is such a beautiful approach. Thank you so much for that. That was put so beautifully, genuinely.
That's very
I had
kind
no
of you.
I had no idea about the human soul being tied to birds and flight and actually the bird's body across different cultures. That's really interesting to see so many people draw that out and have a similar connection to birds and flight. It kind of does remind me, I guess, of the relationship between the extra the terrestrial world and heaven. You know, this kind of flight happening. But to actually link it so directly to a bird, I think is another level that I haven't really heard of recently. And I think that's a really beautiful way of looking at human flight, human emotion, human movement, and also human community. Because if we're just a bunch of birds flying together, that's kind of a sweet notion, isn't it? It kind of links humanity in one, but in a bird's body, but still human.
Absolutely, I think that's such an insightful point. That the in these texts that we've been talking about, the quest for the divine, although there's so much emphasis on solitude, it's very much a communal process. It's all about seeing the community of humans together as one. And like I was saying in the Conference of the Birds, it is a group of birds that go and seek the simor, the mythical bird. So I think community is woven into these texts. It's, although they might seem on the surface to be self-centered, and in some ways they are centered on the self, but it's a self as part of a community.
Definitely. And seeing the reflection of yourself in the mythical bird, i.e. God, that is also so beautiful because you look to something that you admire so much that has so much power, and to see a reflection of yourself in that being must be very amazing for these birds and for the metaphor that they imply, to actually see your own identity reflected in the identity of the divine, and to think that humanity is interlinked with the divine, I think is a beautiful message.
Yes, absolutely. It's this particularly a Sufi idea called a wahdat al-wujud, or the oneness of being. This sense that the true reality is the creator, and all of creation is a shadow or a mirror reflection of the creator. So it binds the creator and the created as in a sense one being.
Definitely.
It's, yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. It's a lovely idea.
Definitely. Um, yes, and I would also love to speak a little bit about your first book, which is called Cultivating the Heart, Feeling and Emotion in 12th and 13th Century Religious Texts. So you argue that, quote, medieval authors, readers, and audiences were far from unfeeling, root-like creatures, unquote, but they were rather what you call cultivators of the heart's terrain. So you define your book as a cartography of affective pain, as it quote, traces the way in which affective stirrings of sorrow, love, and compassion are shaped, expressed, and evoked for the audiences and readership. So, firstly, I would love to know, why were medieval authors, readers, and audiences viewed as so unfeeling by modern day critics? Where was this notion kind of coming from?
I think it's part of a broader issue with looking towards the past and simplifying it. I know we all have that tendency. I have that tendency sometimes. I'm assuming I'm sure not everyone has that tendency, but a lot of us have that tendency, looking towards the past and thinking, oh, things were much simpler back then, when in fact, things were arguably just as complicated and complex as they are today. And the medieval world in particular, it's associated with being this um, murky, ignorant time. We still use that phrase, for example, the Dark Ages, to refer to the early Middle Ages. I mean, it's now an outdated phrase, but it's still used sometimes. So there's this sense of the medieval period being this time of ignorance and a kind of general malaise. And we even still use phrases like this, that was so medieval, to refer to something that's very outdated or brutal in some way. So I think modern critics, not all of them, but some of them, viewed medieval audiences as unfeeling because it's part of this broader problem with seeing the medieval world as being this very simplistic, benighted, ignorant time, when in fact medieval people likely, or I would say definitely from my research, had the same depth of experience, the same depth and range of emotion, that the same depth and range of thought processes that people today have. So yeah, that's why I think there's that tendency to see medieval audiences as, and readers and authors as unfeeling, but in fact, I think the opposite is true.
Definitely. I guess people have that tendency to oversimplify what they don't understand, maybe.
Mm,
And so they think,
yeah.
oh, it's just, it must be very surface level. It must be like this. But actually, these people had their own inner worlds, brains, hearts, thoughts, emotions, experiences, love stories, sorrows, angers, all sorts of things. They were also alive. And so I think it's very, very, very accurate of you and very good of you to pull this out and to make sure that this is not just oversimplified and brushed under the rug, as is often done, I think, with things that we understand less about. Um,
Thank you. Thank you.
yeah,
It's yeah, it's something I'm very passionate about, is kind of trying to reach medieval people in some way and trying to hear what they say about emotion in the sources that survive to us.
definitely. So I would love to hear a little bit more about what your book, the book entitled "Cultivating the Heart," has found about the role of emotion in medieval literature and medieval lives. How did medieval authors, readers, and audiences approach emotion? And what differences does their understanding of emotion have with ours, if any?
Yeah, so again, another great question.
Thank you.
The book Cultivating the Heart, it focused on 12th and 13th century Christian texts. So it's only one aspect of medieval emotion, the medieval emotional landscape. But what I found in those, looking at those texts, 12th and 13th century Christian um, literary texts, is that emotion is really central to all kinds of devotional experiences and devotional practices. And this, the search for God entirely an emotional one, and I'll explain that a bit more. Although it is also a cognitive and intellectual one. I don't think medieval people as readily separated the mind and heart as some of us might do today. And this kind of answers another part of your question, which is differences in medieval understanding of emotion. I don't think the heart and mind were separated as starkly as some of us might do today. So emotion was really central to religious experience, to devotional experience in all its aspects. What we especially find in this period is a real focus on Christ's passion, a real focus on his crucifixion, his torture before the crucifixion, and his death, and a real intense focus on all the details of that, all the details of the torture, all the details of how he died and how much pain it must have involved. There is so much emphasis on that in these 12th and 13th century Christian texts. And what we find is that the authors and readers or audiences, they might well have heard the text rather than read it, as we read today. They try to almost relive the crucifixion with Christ, relive the passion with Christ. They try to feel what he's feeling. They try to be as close as possible to him in his moment of greatest anguish. So that is kind of the centrality of emotion to these texts. I think a lot of it does circle around the passion of Christ, and really trying to feel with him a kind of co-feeling, to use Milan Kundera's phrase, a co-feeling with Christ, and also with witnesses of the crucifixion. So the Virgin Mary, for example, Christ's mother, or John the Evangelist, or other supporters and followers of Christ. It's about feeling with them, feeling what they were feeling, or at least trying to get close to what they were feeling.
Yeah, it seems that there is a very, again, this idea of community comes up, where you're feeling with each other and with Christ. You're feeling with the people that you admire in the divine world, and you're feeling along with the rest of humanity. So there's this very big push towards feeling in a communal way almost, which is really interesting.
That's very true. Again, it's this almost kind of mesh or network of feeling that develops. There's not a sole isolated figure who's feeling on their own, but it's all in relation to others. It's all nurtured and developed by relation to others. That's how the feeling is born and generated and continued.
Definitely. And also, I think from what you're saying, I was also thinking a little bit about empathy, and how in the modern day, I feel like many people strive to have empathy because we now lack empathy, I think, sometimes to our fellow humans. There's a big, I think, focus on the self in the modern day and age. I think capitalism is very self-focused. Like, what can you do to climb the ladder? How can you make money? What can you sell to then pocket a resource, if you will? And so I think we've had to recalibrate our understanding and adherence to this notion of empathy, which the medieval authors, writers, and readers and audiences seem to have a much closer connection with. They actually seem to access this idea of empathy in a much more natural, much more common way. Is that true, do you think?
That's really interesting. I think it's definitely true that there's this um real focus and nurturance of empathy, or on and of empathy, in these texts, that might sit uncomfortably or sit weirdly with a capitalist society, a sort of modern secular capitalist society, that this sort of empathy that's particularly driven by religious devotion. But yeah, I think compassion is such a central emotional or group of emotions in these texts across the medieval period, and I think again, I'll go back to that term of Kundera's co-feeling. There's this real emphasis on not just pitying people in a sort of superficial, distanced way, but actually really feeling what they're feeling, really feeling with them, not sort of putting them at arm's length and feeling a sort of superior, condescending pity, but a much richer sharing of affective space. I think that's the kind of compassion, empathy, co-feeling, whatever term we use to describe it. I think that's the kind of empathy that's at play in these texts, a really rich, multi-layered empathy.
That is such a beautiful notion, I think, this idea of co feeling. I think our society needs a lot more co feeling to arise and to happen right now, especially now with. We have homelessness at an all-time high in certain countries. In a lot of countries, we have people not understanding others, miscommunications, people being distant from each other. We have loneliness epidemics across the world because of online spaces taking precedence over in persons. But we have so many different things that I think could be solved, maybe just made a bit better, let's say, if co-feeling were to come into play, actually.
I completely agree. I think co-feeling is such an important skill, and we could all benefit from learning to co-feel or nurturing our ability to co-feel. And I think I imagine it leads to better psychological health as well in many ways. Um,
Definitely.
and yeah, and as you say, in better social health. So it's, yeah, I think co-feeling is a can be a real beacon, and it doesn't have to, of course, be the kind of co-feeling that's purely driven by a particular religious belief, but a different kind of co-feeling, perhaps adapted for our modern world.
Definitely, completely agree. Um, yes, and so I also would love to turn to this notion of affective literacy. And so, as we've discussed, emotion and religion seem to be very deeply intertwined in these medieval texts. So, you reference Mark Amsler's work on affective literacy, which transforms the reading process into what you call a quote, profoundly active, profoundly formative process for the religious reader. So, how do you see the relationship between religion and emotion in 12th and 13th century texts? I know we've spoken already a little bit about this, but I would love to kind of flesh out more explicitly what role does religion play in the realm of feeling, in the realm of emotion for the medieval author and for the medieval reader, kind of really fleshing out exactly what this relationship is to these people and to the people that they're writing for. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for bringing out Mark Amsler's work. Um, his work and Sarah McNamer's work, where she talks about scripts for the performance of feeling. Those are two important critical ideas or narratives that I've been very influenced by. So to take Mark Amsler first, this idea of affective literacy, he defines as a range of emotional, physiological, somatic responses we can have to text. So they can be crying, becoming aroused. He says, I'm quoting bits of him now. It could even be leaving traces on the page as we read, like tear marks or other marks of reading. So he understands this kind of rich view of literacy, not just the skills to read and write as we might narrowly define literacy, but a kind of richer kind of literacy, one that's emotionally driven. And Sarah McNamara talks about what she calls scripts for the performance of feeling. So she talks about a lot of medieval narratives on the passion that we talked about, on Christ's passion, as being literal scripts. Scripts that people use to perform emotion, to perform feeling, to try to really enact what happened in the passion and try to feel what others in the passion were feeling. So those are, yeah, two very influential critical ideas about medieval emotion in particular. And in terms of the relationship between religion and emotion, in the Christian tradition, I know we've talked a bit about this, but again, I think the passion of Christ is really central. So it's the emotion is often very centered on that particular event in Christian salvation history. And so their religion and emotion are inextricably bound. In the Sufi texts I study, of course, the Passion of Christ doesn't have a central role, but I think there it's really it's really about love of God. That's, I think, where the heart of it lies, and in some ways that's true of the Christian tradition as well. That there's a drive towards being with the one you love, but the one you love isn't a human being, it's God. So there's this way in which the feeling of love intersects with religious devotion, and the two again become inextricably bound. And the search for God becomes a search for the one you love, and those feelings of love drive that search for God. So yeah, that's a bit more, at least how I think religion and emotion intersect in the texts I study.
That's really beautiful. I love how the emotions often are kind of positive, all-consuming emotions like love and light and happiness, and that's actually what brings one closer to the divine. I think that's actually really beautiful, rather than people coming to the divine through anguish and anger and sorrow and pain. It's actually this quest for goodness and quest for good feeling. I think that's really beautiful, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. This emphasis that we see in a lot of the Sufi texts, and also at times in the Christian text, the Anchoritic, and other Christian texts I look at, is this emphasis fundamentally on a love relationship. The Sufi poets speak of God as a beloved. I mean, the collection of poems Tarjuman al Ashwaq, they work within this tradition of pre-Islamic or early Islamic love ode, where a lover searches for the lost beloved. But Ibn Arabi adapts it so that rather than it being a human lover searching for another human beloved, it's the human soul searching for God. So it becomes a love quest. And the Christian text I mentioned, Guide for Anchoresses, the Anchoritic text that I mentioned earlier, that has an amazing passage where it actually imagines Christ as a knight coming to save a damsel trapped in a castle and besieged by the devil. So the idea there is that the damsel is the human soul, and the human soul is besieged by the devil. And Christ comes as this kind of lover knight, this knight who's in love with the human soul, and so comes to save her from the onslaught of the devil. So it's, I think, fundamentally it's this love relationship that is at the core of these texts. That's where the religion, the emotion intersect. to me at least, it always seems to come back to love, and to a particular very intimate kind of love.
That is so beautiful. I love that. I love kind of how these texts seem to take a relationship that a lot of people understand, which is love, and kind of make it spiritual, make it divine, make it otherworldly almost, and ground it not rather in human relationships, but the same kind of love can be applied to the relationship with God or with spirituality, or the divine. I think that is a really beautiful kind of shift that works really well, because humans do understand love so well, or we think we think we do, and but love features so heavily in human texts. You know, we have the romances in the medieval times, we have romances in the modern day. You know, we have so many instances of love in literature, and so to take such a popular subject and transfer it to the divine is such a beautiful idea, I think, and such an effective one almost for conveying to people what exactly this relationship with the divine can look like, because we already know what love looks like in a way. So that's really beautiful, I think.
And yeah, it's I think that's really insightful what you've just said. It kind of gives us a frame of reference almost, because we know how to love, or we think we know how to love, and we feel love. Love is a very common feeling, it's everywhere, and so it gives this path, this way of approaching God, who may otherwise seem entirely unapproachable.
Definitely, definitely. I completely agree. So first of all, I want to say thank you so much for speaking with me today. I so enjoyed it and I learned so much, and I'm sure everyone listening as well has. And so, yeah, I want to say thank you. I massively, massively appreciate it. And this has been amazing. Before I ask my final question, which is, I was wondering if you could give any advice to a few young scholars who would be interested in studying a topic such as yours. Um, you know, younger academics who are just now figuring out what they want to study, and maybe moving to the history of emotions, moving to devotional writing in the medieval times, moving to spiritual texts regarding God and humanity and community. If these types of things interest a young academic, do you have any advice for what they should look out for on their academic journey?
Thank you so much for having me, Daphne. It's been an absolute delight. I've so enjoyed this conversation. Thank you, yeah, very much. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
And to answer your question, I think what I'd suggest first of all is to listen to podcasts such as these, or look at various websites that center on the history of emotion, or the history of religion and religion in emotion. So, for example, Queen Mary University in London has a great blog on the history of emotions. If people just Google that, it should come up. So that's a really great starting point for getting to grips with the history of emotions and that whole area of study. There's also something called the Matheson Trust, Matheson Trust, that has a lot of religious texts. So that's a great resource as well. So I'd encourage your listeners, in particular young academics who are starting out, to explore those resources, listen to podcasts. There's lots of YouTube videos on the sort of subjects I've been discussing, and just get a sense of what particular texts inspire them, or what particular ideas inspire them, what particular historical periods inspire them, and then to take that as a starting point and run with it. So that would be my advice, is to begin with some general resources, and then land on more specific areas of interest.
That is such brilliant advice. Thank you so much. And that's very helpful for citing those resources. Like, I'm sure everyone really appreciates it. So thank you so much. And I hope you have a brilliant rest of your day. And thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you so much, Daphne. Have a lovely rest of your day.